We're live. Hey, welcome. It's Tuesday, February 14th. We're going to work this afternoon on H66. We are here. We have two folks who will be back presently who are out on bill introduction duties, but we are pretty much ready to go. I have us marked down as being on page 33, line 9. And it is, just trying to think if there's anything I should say now or just let my brain bounce back to it later. But I think getting right into the work right now will be sufficient. Just a reminder, I suppose, that we do have a public hearing on Thursday night over in the Pavilion Building from 5 to 7. I'm still making sure with that when we work that day that we still get a couple hours off during the day, acknowledging that we have the meeting going on. But I'm going to work with leadership on that a little bit before I can't blanketly go, yes, take the afternoon off. So 2070 refunds of contributions, and I just want to kind of put out my memory of the testimony on this from the tax department in particular is that it would be really difficult to do. That whether it's access or refund as it's called for, it would be really hard for employers to not put in the money just to single out the folks making this level of income. What do people remember from the testimony from the tax department? I just remember that this proposal as written is functionally and technically really difficult to do. Yeah.
I would completely agree with you on that there. Sounds like, I don't remember what the exact dollar amount was that up to $25,000 you'd actually pay in, but it sounds like the kind of work that goes into and refunding it, and as you said, the employer being part of that and everything didn't really pencil out in their opinion. So that's what I remember as well.
What do other people recall or have thoughts on this section here? I prefer to hear people's thoughts on this. From my perspective, just quickly, the idea is not wrong. It's just, can we really implement this? And I heard that it was difficult. So I'm just throwing it out there for conversation and then a decision on whether or not, our job right now is to get through the rest of the bill and then come back to this unless we have a clear decision on what to discuss it or to cut it. But we've been working on the bill, the way that we've been working on the bill is to get through the bill and then come back to these conversations. I just kind of do a thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever, have a deeper conversation when we get there.
Okay, so I have a question about what our options would be in this section, so we'll flag that for later and come on back.
Yep.
Okay.
Just for the sake of discussion, the total premium on $25,000 is $137.50. That's at 55.
That's both the employee and employer.
So if you're splitting that, you're talking about it 68, 75.
Right.
It's a lot of processing.
A lot of processing. And people who are not filing for an earned income tax credit. Filing for an earned income tax credit means you have children of a certain age. And so you have to file in order to receive that, which is way more than the $67 it would be. And if you're not filing for the earned income tax credit, then you don't have to file, basically. You're 20 or 25,000. So let's just, for our purposes, to your question is, the question we'll have is do we think we should leave this in for now or take it out? And that'll be the discussion that we have. Yeah.
I believe the commissioner mentioned a third option too, which is to switch it to a flat credit.
Yeah.
That's on your income tax. So, which might require redrafting it into the Title 32. But that, I will flag that in the conversation.
And a reminder that most of the financial stuff like this will be reviewed most deeply in the next committee. And so just leave that out there and we'll come right back to it. We'll come back to it before we finish our work. And that finishes section 1 of the bill. So section 2, here you are, Damien, chapter 32 is tax section.
Yeah, this is language that is housekeeping language to the extent that Department of Taxes collects the contributions in the bill. This gives them the authority to share tax return information with the other entities administering the program. Commissioner of Financial Regulation would come out if you remove financial regulation from the actual administration, so it would just be the Director of the Division of Family and Medical Leave. And Commissioner Bolio highlighted that we likely should have language if you continue to provide an option for businesses to opt out by providing their own insurance plan, or satisfying it through something like that, then you should provide for the return of information to the tax department so that they're not looking for a withholding from those employers. So that you wanted to see more explicit language around that if you keep that option in.
Okay. Section 3, adoption of rules. This starts off with the first A, B, and C is rules from different agencies would adopt rules by April 1, 2025. Carry out the provisions that are in the specific provisions. And again, the question about C is whether or not that's going to be necessary or whether we should, have it in there. Section D jumps ahead to October 1, 2026. And can you talk about that? Is this that section that we talked about prior that the Division of Family Medical Leave had to adopting the rules to determine the significant personal bond is, or like a family? That's the section that we had a conversation about on Friday.
Yes, so we talked about this on Friday. I have in the marked up draft I'm working on, I've added language in regarding how that would be determined. So if you keep the added language, you may not need to keep this section. They would have to adopt rules anyway, covering the whole program. And the added language covers. Oh.
That was you 20 seconds ago.
Feedback.
I hate hearing my own voice.
Especially from 20 seconds ago, because it's like, stop judging me.
Yeah, God, I sound boring. So if you keep in the language in the new definition section, you may not need this language. You could still leave it like this. It would just delay making this rule for an extra year and a half. You could also provide that this rule get adopted ahead of time, because this is timed to coincide exactly with the start of the program, which means that if you if you needed to take leave and you keep in the significant personal bond provision for someone who has a significant personal bond with you, the language would literally, that rule would literally be effective the day that you're eligible to take leave. So you may want to move that effective date up too, if you keep the rulemaking language in there and have it done separately from the rest of the rules.
If this is a set date,
Yeah.
this is the opening, this is proposed to be the opening day of the policy to the public after the 15 months of collection of the original money, so. All right, just bracket that and we'll come back to it. I mean, I don't know what we're going to do with that previous section. That I believe the previous section is up for conversation as well.
Yeah, so it'll, it's in the definition section. I've added additional language to the definition to try to provide some clarity as to what the intent is, and that would have to be adjusted, depending on how the committee wants to move forward with it.
Okay.
So next, we've got the education and outreach, section 4. This requires information out 30 days before taxes start being collected. And then requires translations into 5 additional languages beyond English and an accessible website.
And just to be clear, when we say things like honor before, if there's, I mean, not that we have a track record or an expectation that it would only take, that it would take less time. But this would be if the departments had everything ready to go that they needed to provide, it could go out prior to.
Yes.
I just want to make sure, like, honor before is one of those including but not limited to type phrases.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's worth noting, this gives them 60 days after rules are required to be effective in order to get the education and outreach materials. They could develop them concurrently to some extent, but to some extent, they're going to depend on those final rules and forms. So that really is more of an administrative question of whether 60 days is enough time. Your alternatives are either to move the date later or to stagger what information needs to come out when. So.
And this is, again, just to point out, if we're dropping the requirements to, if an employer has one employee to be covered by leave, they're notifying every employer in the state.
Yes. So, and this just requires them to develop and make available, not to affirmatively reach out to every single employer.
Okay. Section 5 is the appropriation that is proposed to start the process of building the system. Now, this is different than in years past. This is saying that out of the general fund, and again, this will be determined finally in the next actually in the next committees, this will be dealt with in appropriations because they're the ones who expend the money. So they have to make the determination that that's a right number. Thank you. For what's proposed in the bill. And what this does is, what this is saying, no matter what the number is, what this is saying is the general fund is giving $20 million to this division for startup. costs. But it's not a loan like we've heard of in the past where DFR might loan something, they might say that we'll front you the money in a different way than this. And this is saying the payback for this is essentially a $20 million credit for the state's contributions to once the contributions get started, rather than paying it back to a separate entity in cash once that's raised. Is my memory anywhere near correct?
Mostly, yeah. So this is $20 million credit against contributions. That's exactly right. The way it would have worked under the old system or the old proposals is essentially authorizing and requiring finance and management to deficit spend. So it would draw the special fund down into the red. And then the special fund would have to climb back out. And so if you look at the projections for the old program, it shows the fund dropping below zero and then climbing back out as contributions start. This starts with $20 or $20. It's just gonna take. So
That was a rough game.
this starts with $20 million. Just a rounding error.
Back when $20 was $20.
Yeah. But yeah, so it starts with $20 million in there and the fund can spend down against that. And the idea is that whatever the ultimate number is in there, which is going to be dependent on the program and then the projections from JFO. So whatever that amount is can be spent down until that July 1 when they begin collecting contributions, at which point there will be revenue coming into the program, which allows them to spend that money on things like computers and staffing for the initial push to get rules made and get the system stood up. And then in that second year, as the money is accumulating, they're training staff to administer benefits and building out sort of the new division that's going to run this. So that's the way this is designed to work, is rather than having what would essentially be 2 years of deficit spending, you've got a fund that has money in it that can then spend down that money and earn interest on it during that time.
Representative James Lynn, Chestnut Hampton.
I don't think I have a question anymore.
And Chestnut Hampton.
So I know that the numbers are still, GFO's numbers are still very much in flux. The expectation is that if startup costs will probably exceed whatever that seed money is. And so this is just a buffer, so there's less deficit spending, is that correct?
So the idea behind this is to basically project what your spending is going to be. Yes, you could run over, in which case you run into the potential deficit spending or request for an additional appropriation. But the idea is to project what your costs will be. What's the estimated cost for IT? What's the estimated cost for staffing? And then the state basically loans that money out against its future contributions. In this case, it's an interest-free loan. They're Colorado, which is the state that I took this idea from, or that this idea came from. I shouldn't say I took it from. I used their language for drafting the sponsor. Thought the idea was a good one. But Colorado, where this idea came from, I think they charged, if I remember right, a 1% annual interest against that. So that that money was really a loan from the state, paid off through the relief from the state's contributions. But the state was getting a return on that money over that time. I could probably find that in here, but I'm not sure it's. But yeah, it is an option there that you could say, that money shall accrue interest, or the remaining balance shall accrue interest at a rate of 1% per annum, or something like that if you wanted to. Or at the prime rate, whatever you chose to do.
Okay. Section 6 is adequacy of reserves report, and that's a standard report that we're asking for at least 3 years. And then we had reports that earlier about on February 1st or what have you, they're different reports. Like we're gonna receive a couple of different reports from the division, is that right?
Yeah, so the division is reporting on the adequacy of reserves here, which is really just how's the fund doing, and is 75% an adequate reserve, or is it too much? Because that's another potential question there. I mean, if you look at other states, some of them have reserves as low as 35%. But this is where Vermont's come out. That's the main actual report that's left in here versus prior years. The other report that's in the bill currently is the annual report on the rate, which dovetails with this report, but it's not the same thing. So this is basically looking at, are those reserves sufficient and appropriate for the risks that we think the pool is exposed to? Particularly given that we're a small state, smaller pool, and the other one is basically saying, is the rate of contribution sufficient to fund another year, or do we need to change it? Is it too high? Is it too low?
All right. Yes.
So the first report on the adequacy of reserves would be essentially 6 months, 7 months after the contributions begin, and there's been no withdrawals from the fund.
Yes. So it's set for. Yeah, the way it's set up is actually a report back on whether the division thinks that its current projected rate of accumulation is going to be appropriate. And then really your second one, the way it's written right now, would only give you 3 months experience. And then the third one. So one thing you may want to consider doing is just bumping them all out by a year.
Thinking.
That hadn't thought about that when I wrote those dates in there. So I think that may have just been a drafting error on my part.
Well, they're just they're far out, but I think just talking through this, where that actually falls is reasonable. And I've asked JFO to come back in and Tammy, you may be able to answer this just from having notes with JFO, but I want to have JFO in, see if they can come in either later today or tomorrow to talk about the latest numbers, which includes what is the expected reserve going to be. I just want to be clear what we're proposing in the bill. I know we've heard different numbers from different states, but I just want to be clear about what, and I think JFO has provided us with documents that show these numbers, but I want to know if there's updated numbers, just so that we know that $20 million is the first expectation based on it's an estimate of what it would take to build out. But then let's say that's accurate, just for the sake of argument, then it's the question of whether or not what the reserves are that the bank account has to show before they want to open the doors, basically, is what the reserve account does. So they'll have numbers, I would imagine that they have the numbers about what 15 months of raising money at that particular rate would create.
Thank you. I had a question which led to my own second question, which probably JFO would be great to hear from, so thank you.
And I bet we could hear it 20 seconds from now.
Hopefully it's just as good as a question in 20 seconds. So I was originally was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Why would you have the report on what you think maybe they should be all? Then I got also thinking that by that time, we're kind of building the solvency of this on the higher earners that are going to pay in way more than they'll ever be able to use. So by that January 26th date, would we know if some of those have found their own plan because they are paying it to such a high level at that 340,000 or whatever it is, 320,000, I think. That because of that, maybe it was easy for them to find a plan that would actually cost their employees much less for those high wage employers, which would put a big hit on the overall system. Would some of those companies, because it's 15 months out, if they got their own plan that was going to be enacted on the same date, and said, well, we found this private plan, we're going to go with that on that date, so we're not going to pay in for this 15 months because we're going to use this private system. Is that an option for them to say, here's our private plan that we're going to be using, so I'm not going to pay in for this 15 months? And I feel like if that happens, that's such a, like I said, that's kind of how the system's built, to draw from that high end, keep the payroll tax low, that if by that date we know that there's a plan out there for those high wage jobs that's causing them to not be in the system, which is really putting
That's a good question. The bill doesn't say when you can opt out through a private plan. There's no cutoff date on that. Theoretically, an employer could opt out early in the pay-in process and say, hey, I've got a private plan, it meets all the requirements, and then put it in for a certification and go from there. So that's probably a policy question as to whether you want to do something along the lines of allowing employers to opt out at any time from that first July 1 when contributions start, or you want to delay that opt out until 2026 when benefits are scheduled to start.
But the rules, the statute for the section that talks about review of a private plan, that becomes effective July 1, 2023.
2025. Oh gosh.
You have to jump ahead to the end. No, I'm just trying to clarify because it's a good question.
July 1, 2025. So, it gives you 2 years from the proposed effective date in the bill to figure out. It really just is a good question there as to whether you want to allow an opt-out from employers that are going to be doing a private plan anyway at that July 1 date, which would then, if that was the case, and for example, you did see, imagine a Global Foundries or someone that's a large employer decided to opt out, it could change your numbers for that, January 2026. You could say, It could change the size of the pool, it could change the numbers. I don't know, I'm not a statistician or an economist.
Right.
Yeah, so I can't tell you if, you had an employer with 1,000 employees opt out, to the extent, I think there's a handful of those in Vermont at best.
Let's save that question for JFO.
Yeah,
I will say, current bill by proposing it to be 0.55%, and including Vermonters who make twice the Social Security. 4 years ago, the previous version of this, when it left this committee, it was about 0.55 or 0.58, someplace in there, with employees. Again, there's so many different variables, it's almost worthless to say, what we were trying to raise, because we had 80%, we didn't have 100% wage replacement, we had a bunch of different levels, but to raise the money, the numbers are much the same except for doubling the Social Security and offering a higher wage replacement. The numbers, but the payroll tax is approximately the same. But again, that's moving the dials around. So it doesn't really get to your question about what it would take if we lost 2,500 or 3,000 or 8,000 people.
yeah, and I don't know what the experience has been in other states at this point.
I don't think
For
it's
private plans. And a JFO might have a better sense of what that looks like, to the extent that info's out there. But yeah, I don't know how that's impacted other states at this point.
Building on inspired by Representative Parsons, but going off on my own tangent.
tangent.
My own tangent. As written, so we have employers pay in for 15 months before their employees can receive.
And employees.
Right. Contributions are paid 15 months before employees can receive benefits. As new businesses start up, come online, if a business starts up in October of 26
Mm-hmm.
and they enroll in this program,
Yep.
and they begin paying benefits, can they also begin, they pay contributions, can they begin receiving benefits immediately, or is there a pay-in period?
Depends on,
All parties
it depends on the employee's eligibility, not the business's start date.
Right.
So, if I start a business in 2028, but I hire people who have all been working in Vermont before that, they're all likely eligible from day one. Even though my business has only been participating in the program by withholding and submitting its payroll taxes for, a week. I could have someone go out on leave, so.
Representative Parsons. Did you ever hear that?
No.
Do you have a second question?
I don't think you're gonna play that now. I think so. Okay, so thank you.
Yeah, so, but again, using that example, if you started a new business, but you hired and brought in people from another state, even if it was New York or New Hampshire that had these programs, doesn't matter, they haven't paid into the Vermont program for 2 quarters.
Yeah, so, what you get to, then same thing, yeah, if I'm a Massachusetts employer and I now open up a branch in Vermont and I bring a couple of my employees up from Massachusetts, those employees would become eligible to take leave under the program after they've earned 2 quarters of wages up here. Because of their time with me as an employer, they might be eligible for unpaid leave before that, but they won't be eligible for benefits until they have 2 quarters of wages paid in.
Unless if they're moving people, it's the same company they qualified before, they could be as generous as they need to be to.
Right,
But for our program, they have to, the new employees would have to have been there for 2 quarters. paying into the Vermont income tax.
Right, assuming they're gonna participate in the private plan, so,
Public plan.
the public plan, and they're not a Google that might come here with its own private plan. So,
Okay. Okay. Section 7 now, we're out of the money or the leave insurance portion of the bill, and this next section is, these next two sections have to do with the Parental and Family Leave Act, the Vermont version of it. And so the first key difference is the definition of employer, which we dealt with on the insurance section at the beginning, which is just reducing an employer is someone who employs one or more individuals in Vermont. I think earlier in the year, I pointed out that this is a case where there are many different definitions of employer and employee throughout our statutes. This one was the one that said 10 or more individuals for parental leave and who are working at least 30 hours a week. And for purposes of family leave, 15 or more individuals for an average of at least 30 hours a week. We would be changing this to not delineate which leave they're taking, how many employees the employer has, nor the amount of hours that were set. So this is an expansion of the unpaid, this is an expansion of who's covered for leave, whether it's paid or unpaid. And job protection through that leave.
yeah, this is an expansion of the job protection law. So putting the paid leave aside, this is really, it's worth thinking about these as two separate pieces. They don't have to move together. So this is an expansion of an existing law that protects your job if you go on a qualified leave. In prior iterations of this bill, this has changed, but not necessarily tracked with the actual paid leave program. So for example, the paid leave program might cover everyone, but only certain employees are eligible for job protection, either because of the size of their employer or the amount that they've worked for that employer. So that's something that's just worth keeping in mind as you're considering the different levers you can pull in the bill.
And not that we spend a lot of time comparing and contrasting with the governor's program, but in this particular case, they use a similar, I believe they use a similar definition of employer in terms of who's available to voluntarily join the program and make employees eligible. But there's not a proposal to change the underlying unpaid leave section, if I'm not mistaken. It's just a difference between age 66 and what we heard from, and if I've got that wrong, as always, if I have that wrong, please correct me.
Got the governor's plan somewhere in here. But yeah, the governor's plan differs first and foremost, I think, in that it doesn't propose changes to this underlying law. It would so I'm looking at this, it says 2 or more employees. In July 1, 2024, they'll open up, the Hartford plans to open up its insurance program to employers with 2 or more employees. And then in July 1, 2025, it would expand to employers with 1 employee and self-employed individuals. So you're looking at They will eventually get to the coverage for one or more, but it's phased to get there, and then it doesn't change this underlying job protection law, so.
Representative Parsons.
Thank you. I just want to highlight this part because I think this is just as big an impact to as the other section, I mean, the section with all the other pages in it. I think it's just a massive change in that the fact that we always think of when we say small business, you know, that 50 employees or less for federally seems a little ridiculous for Vermont, like 49 employees, you're not really that small. Which is why I think it brought down to 10, you know, because the intent originally that's more Vermont to be 10 or less. And I think it got put there because we realized the burden you're placing on small businesses when you've got 5 people and 2 are out, or 8 people, and you know, you scale it down to that much, it makes a big difference on actual small businesses. So I think that's why it's been at 10 this whole time. And whether that's the right number or not is debatable, but I just want to highlight that this is a massive change for the actual small businesses in Vermont.
Thank you. Representative Lamont.
Yeah, so I just had a random question and thought, and I don't want a long answer on this. It's just a curiosity around when we're talking about, it just made me think about employers who are employing individuals but are not compensating them. And I don't know if that was even thought of, or if that's on people's radar, that is a thing that happens.
Like interns.
For not only interns, but for people who work for Higher Ability, who are working with organizations like Higher Ability, formerly known as Voc Rehab, where they do work programs, and so they are employed through a place of employment, which would be their employer. However, they're compensated through the state through this program. And so would they be considered an employee in that aspect, or would they not be considered an employee?
Oh, contractors.
Okay, so we've got 3 different concepts here, and I apologize. This is likely to be a long answer.
Oh, goodness. Okay, never mind. Scrap it. Would they be considered an employee? That was the question.
Yeah, so interns, it's complicated. Typically, if you're a student intern, you're getting college credit or something like that, and getting an academic benefit from the program. You're not considered an employee, you're considered an intern. It's a little bit hazy where that line of academic credit and benefit from the program ends. But generally, once the employee stops getting any more academic and educational benefit from the program, the employer has to treat them as an employee and start paying them, in which case they'd have to start paying them at least minimum wage, deducting contributions, et cetera. For the Voc Rehab program, I am not super familiar with that, so take this with a grain of salt, but generally the entity that is paying you is your employer, even if they are loaning you out to perform work for someone else.
Excellent.
And then independent contractors are covered as self-employed individuals in this case, which is likely to cover, and not trying to stir a can of worms here, but individuals who are in the gig economy and may not qualify as employees, or maybe are in a gray area where their employer says, we don't think you're an employee, and that's not being contested. And that is, as many of you know, a highly contentious issue right now. So I don't want to get in too deep there, but they would be eligible to be covered as a self-employed individual too. So obviously there are potential ramifications with that.
Per diem workers would also fall under that category.
Per diem workers would, a lot of it's going to depend on the nature of your per diem work. But for example, if you're on contract as a substitute teacher, but just paid on a per diem basis, you're an employee. Same thing if you're a per diem nurse that's on contract to fill shifts as necessary, you're an employee.
And I think it's safe to say it's a contentious thing, not just now, but, you know, what becomes in certain fields, without going on for hours, it is contentious about who can be an employee under those gig economy circumstances, and so.
Yeah, and this has been, I mean, it's not a new issue. As long as you've had part-time, per diem, contract, short-term workers, there have been questions about where do you draw that line and who gets to be eligible for protections under the employment laws. And anytime you write in a test, some people are getting cut out and some people are being put in unless you literally write it. So it's everyone is covered. But even in this case, you will have people who are on a contract basis where the employer says, not my employee, if you want to enroll, you need to pay in the full amount of contributions. And then you could always make a policy decision to reduce contributions for self-employed, which at least one state that I know of has done that. So.
Or is that just intentional?
Just wondering if we flagged, I believe it was Commissioner Bolio's concern that self-employed people report on a quarterly basis. Most employees don't. It's an annual basis, so that potentially makes it difficult to do the 2-quarter employment. So
the issue is that at tax, they don't, as I understand the issue, they don't break things out by social security number on a quarterly basis. Your employer sends in a quarterly withholding, but they send a lump sum. And then after January 1st, they complete their W-2s and they file them. And that's when the tax department gets an individualized by social security number breakdown of wages. So that does create a difficulty for tracking the employees with the 2-quarter pay-in. With self-employed individuals, there's a requirement that once you enroll, you provide documentation of income as required by the division. So they could require, even if you're making estimated payments, they could require some sort of quarterly reporting in the same way that you do quarterly reporting for unemployment insurance, where you do report by social security number, because they have to be able to tell at the unemployment insurance division, you know, if you get laid off in the first week of the next quarter, they need to be able to pull that wage information and figure out what you're entitled to as a benefit. I think what Commissioner Bolio brought up is that looking to the unemployment system for wage information might provide, within the current systems, might provide quicker wage information unless you're having employers file quarterly withholding reports with the division. So there are a couple different ways forward. The complication with unemployment insurance, as we know, is that they're struggling with a computer system that is frankly older than me, and trying to make that work well past its life expectancy at this point while they work to get a new system in place. So there are potential complications there, but I think that's what Commissioner Bolio was getting at, is that tax isn't going to have individualized information to give to the division, so you need to collect it some other way, even if tax is collecting the contributions.
And that's what the 2 years is for. Representative James, to figure out, to set rules and to do the negotiations.
Right.
Yeah. Representative James.
So to go back to the self-employed thing, at a very 101 level. So I'm self-employed in the real world. And I pay quarterly taxes based on what I earned last year. And some years I'm way off. And I settle up at tax time. I earned less than I thought, or I got some amazing contract and I earned more than I thought. So how would I pay him?
So right now, you're paying in at the same time you do your estimated payments for tax. The issue here is the one that you just highlighted, that when you're self-employed, your estimated payments are often not
Accurate.
accurate, right? You can't predict from one year to the next when you're gonna have that big contract that has you, earning extra money in a year, the time of year that's usually slow for you, or whatever it is, or you're gonna go through a drought. The bill right now does provide that if you enroll, you provide documentation, additional documentation of income as required by the director. The director has the authority to require more real-time documentation of income.
Okay.
But the question is, how would that true up with, and I honestly don't know what the right answer is here at this point, how you would do the true up between those estimated payments and the actual. One of the systems we have set up in the unemployment insurance world that might be helpful here is very similar to what you do with estimated payments. But the employees are eligible to take out benefits if they become unemployed, but the employer is basically going off of past experience with unemployment. And this is for nonprofits that agree to reimburse the fund for the full amount of their liability. And for some of them, if they're worried about that lump sum being due, they can make estimated payments and then true up. I don't know what the best answer is, though, for how the department would do that unless it went to direct reporting to the division. Similar to quarterly unemployment, where you say, this is what I earned last quarter.
Right.
And you have 30 days after the end of the quarter to report. And then they look at probably the first 4 of your last 5 completed calendar quarters to give them 45 days to catch up on that information. Because by the time you file, it's going to take them time to process and make sure that you file accurately and filed the right paperwork and submitted the right amount, et cetera. But that's an alternative there, is to either look at something where you're making an estimated payment and then you have a true up with the division every year, but in the meantime, you can collect benefits off of that, or where you're doing a quarterly true up with the division directly rather than doing estimated payments through tax.
Right. Okay.
So,
Thanks.
sorry, I wish there was a easier answer.
So that takes us through to number 5. Definition of family leave, which
Yes.
again makes the change from the 10 employees and the 30 hours a week. It just defines.
Yeah, it takes out some of the references to employer, which are no longer necessary if you make employer 1 or more. And really, were not necessary in the original bill. In my opinion, they're sort of belts and suspenders. The other thing that it does is it adds foster care. It adds a reference to the employee's pregnancy.
And that's important to tie it into, we ran across conflicts where it was, well, it takes care of the birth of the child, but what about before the birth of the child, and so this was added in for that reason.
Yeah, it actually, there was also an internal inconsistency. There is an internal inconsistency in the law. In section 471, we define parental leave without including pregnancy. In section 472, which is the actual leave law, we say that parental leave during the employee's pregnancy and following the birth of a child. So that the law itself is internally inconsistent currently, and this trues it up between both the new insurance program and internally within the job protected leave law.
Councilor Farley.
This might just be splitting hairs. I just want to make sure that this would cover any sort of miscarriage.
Um,
And if not, how would we make that change?
that's so I think during the employee's pregnancy would cover that. But I think if you want to cover it for sure, I would make it explicit. Because I think what I think is arguably covered when you get into a situation where you're an employee asking for leave to recover from a miscarriage. And it doesn't qualify as a serious illness or serious health condition. I can imagine that you don't want to be having that argument with your employer's HR department or your manager.
It's I don't want to say it's covered, but it's addressed when we talk about the applying for the insurance. At least we talked about you're going to apply for it in advance when you know the presumed due date of your child.
Mm-hmm.
But if there's an emergency, which I don't think it says the word miscarriage, but if there's an emergency, premature birth, then you can apply after that because it's an emergency. But I don't know that it covers.
Yeah, I
it
think
specifically.
that it would be worth, if you want to cover it, I think you should spell it out to ensure that there's, similar to the situation we ran into last year where we received testimony about challenges individuals had with the old serious illness language, when employers were questioning whether a serious injury fell under the serious illness language. If you want to cover it, it's better to be explicit, and then no one is left scrambling to get an interpretation or to try to have that argument or, calling.
So we can add after D, if we want. We can add, possibly, I would put, if we're going to consider, I would put it in, after D, just after but again, let's flag that. This more doing, if I ask this question, it's policy stuff, but do people have any objections to including the word? It's not defining it as a serious illness, it's just stating that it's a miscarriage.
Right, and so again, I'm not a doctor, but a miscarriage isn't necessarily going to reach the serious illness level, but you may need time off from work to see a doctor to get treatment to ensure you don't develop an infection and to ensure that your body is recovering properly in the same way. So I think,
And at least 2 weeks is going to be bereavement.
Right.
So but I again, put it down. I don't have a problem with considering it at all.
I marked it in, so.
Okay. Section 6 defines family member, and it goes, we've talked about this a couple of different times. It goes on through to 39.
There's on the bottom of 39. So the So I have a couple of notes on 39 from earlier discussion.
Right, like section E is the significant personal bond.
Right, so updating that and the in loco parentis language, which I've got that one drafted, I'll just add it in. The other two things were under, I have to catch up with you here. If you look under 3, a person who stood in loco parentis for the employee, there was actually the question of what if you're an individual who's working at age 17, you're not over the age of 18, and the person who stands in loco parentis for you becomes sick or something like that. So that was a question that came up in the walkthrough. And I can just flag that for discussion. The other was, there was some question in the grandparent, grandchild, or sibling, whether you wanted to include someone who stood in loco parentis for the employee's parent. So that was had also come up in the earlier discussion. I can leave that just as for discussion. Okay.
Representative James.
Sorry if I missed this in the testimony of the bill. Where does time off for substance misuse treatment come in?
That's a very good question. So under the current definition of family leave, it includes the serious illness or injury of an employee, which if you go to the serious health condition definition under federal law, it includes residential treatment and so forth. This does not explicitly cover that. And that's one of the things that we had highlighted to discuss, because right now it means accident, injury, disease, or physical or mental condition that poses imminent danger of death, requires inpatient care in a hospital, or requires continuing in-home care under the direction of a physician. So substance abuse disorder could fall under all 3 of those at different points, but going to, for example, treatment for recovery at an inpatient recovery.
It's not a hospital.
Exactly, and it's not in-home care under the direction of a physician. So going to the serious health condition definition, if we look back at the federal regulations that I sent the committee, it talks about residential care and treatment facilities being included as within that. And so one of the things that I've drafted in the next version for the committee is language that would bring us to the serious health condition definition, 2 alternatives that would bring us there, which would also cover treatment by someone who's not a physician, which you could very well have in one of the, for example, a residential treatment situation, you could be under the treatment of someone who is a licensed healthcare provider, but not a physician. So I'll just flag that for the same change, and then we can discuss that.
Okay. I do want to have when we get through this next draft, I do want to have a thumbs up, thumbs down on section E. Conversation about it.
Yep.
So page 40, it defines serious illness or injury.
Yep.
Just adds injury, or injury or injury to the existing definition of it. Section 8, leave. my overall question for this, I think you answered this last time we went through, or which was when we see the word leave, we're assuming that it's for job protected leave in this section.
Yeah,
Okay, because it's defined as such. Or it's just, this is the section.
this is the section that provides,
Right.
yeah, job protection for this sort of leave.
So this definition, or this section here, 472, which is what you were talking about earlier, by cutting parental leave and just leaving it as family leave, it's just not making the difference between the 10 and the 15, taking leave. If you have 10 employees or 15 employees, it's just taking leave.
Right, we've defined it all as family leave in this bill, which is just a drafting choice by the sponsor. Instead of saying parental leave, family leave, military leave, safe leave, we've got family leave, military leave, and safe leave, and bereavement leave in this bill. You could condense things further. The choice was just made to have one less term here and to just call this family leave.
Section B on line 18, again, because this is the unpaid leave section, it's just saying the employee may use accrued sick leave, vacation leave, or family medical leave insurance.
Or short-term disability or other insurance. So, the idea is to cover, the existing law only talks about accrued paid leave that you've got through your employer. And it allows the employer to cap that at 6 weeks. Under this, it removes the cap and it expands it to these other kinds of benefits, both the benefits provided in the bill and short-term disability and other insurance that you may have through your employer, which in some cases may provide you with a better benefit.
But it doesn't, and the last 3 lines on the top of page 41 reinforce the idea that it does not extend the leave provided by this section.
Exactly, you can't, you don't get to piggyback your vacation on your paid leave and get a legal right to job protection. Your employer may let you do that, but that's between you and your employer. The law doesn't require that.
All right, so from line 5 down to line 14, there's technical changes in existing law, but line 15 gets close to what Representative Bartley, I mean, this is a place where we may be able to use the word miscarriage, because it's talking about unanticipated serious illness or injury or premature birth. It would be very easy to put for miscarriage in there.
Yep.
Section, line 18, section 4 just adds the word or injury, the phrase or injury.
And that language would change if we go to serious health condition.
Page 42, those were primarily technical changes. Page 43, line 5. Amy, can you talk about that deletion?
So this is language that's in the existing law, and it allows an employee to waive their rights under the job protected leave law at the time the need arises. So in other words, basically saying, I'm going to take the leave and I'm waiving my right to job protection. The sponsor asked to have that stricken, so an employee can't waive their right. An employee can always choose not to go back. But the concern, as I understood it, and I don't want to speak for the sponsor or sponsors, is that the concern was that employees could be coerced into waiving their rights. And they didn't want to provide that option. We do have other employment laws that say any waiver of the rights provided by this shall be void. So we explicitly prohibit that in other areas. So that this is just removing the ability to waive that. There's nothing that requires the employee to go back to their job. but it does require the employer to give them back their job if the employee wants it back.
Okay,
That's the change here.
thank you. Let's take 7 minutes till 2:30 or 6 minutes, whatever it is, 7 minutes till 2:30 to do safety.